Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the channel, where we explore the most haunting mysteries that time has refused to solve. Tonight, we travel to the quiet border town of Texarkana, a place that once seemed untouched by darkness until the spring of 1946 changed everything. In the years following World War II, Texarkana was a picture of small-town America. People were rebuilding their lives. The streets were filled with music again, and the local drive-in theaters were alive with laughter. But beneath the calm surface, something was waiting, something that would soon turn peaceful nights into a long season of fear. It began under the silver glow of the moon. Couples parked on country roads just outside town, enjoying the cool night air. It was a place of privacy, a bit of escape from the world. But one February evening, that quiet routine was shattered forever. A man wearing a crude white mask, a sack with holes cut for eyes, appeared from the shadows. What followed would mark the beginning of a series of attacks that left Texarkana forever changed. Over the next 10 weeks, the town would face an unseen presence, a figure locals would later call the Phantom. The newspapers could not keep up with the panic. Families locked their doors for the first time. Stores sold out of firearms. People began traveling in groups, too afraid to drive alone after dark. Every strange noise outside, every creak of a porch board, made hearts race. The attacks seemed random, but followed a chilling pattern. Young couples, quiet roads, late hours, and an enemy no one could describe clearly. Even those who survived remembered little more than the blinding beam of a flashlight and the echo of heavy footsteps fading into the dark. Texarkana became a town suspended between fear and confusion. The police, working across both Texas and Arkansas jurisdictions, struggled to find solid leads. Clues appeared and vanished: tire tracks, bullet casings, whispered rumors. And while detectives worked around the clock, the Phantom seemed to slip through every net they cast. What made this case so unforgettable was not only the violence, it was the mystery. There was no motive, no confession, no clear identity. It was as if the person behind the mask had never existed at all. Decades later, the question still lingers: who was the Phantom of Texarkana? A restless drifter passing through, a local hiding in plain sight, or someone the town trusted until the moon came out? Tonight, we reopen the case. We will look at the evidence, the suspects, and the fear that gripped an entire community, a fear that has never truly faded. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let us step back into the spring of 1946, when the night itself became a suspect. By the time the second attack struck, Texarkana was no longer just a small town, it was a headline. The newspapers had found a name for the faceless terror haunting their community: the Phantom Killer. The title came naturally. No one had ever seen his face, no one could trace his steps, and every time he vanished, it felt as though he had melted into the night itself. The word phantom captured exactly what people felt: an invisible presence that could appear anywhere, at any time. Soon, the name took on a life of its own. Radio stations warned listeners not to go out after dark. The local police chief gave press conferences surrounded by armed officers. Reporters from Dallas and New Orleans arrived in town, eager to capture the mystery that had gripped Texarkana. And with every new article, the legend of the Phantom grew stronger. Some said he was a war veteran who had come home broken by battle. Others whispered he was a local man, someone who worked by day and hunted by night. A few believed he was not one man at all, but two, taking turns to confuse the investigation. The truth was, fear did not need facts, it only needed a name, and the Phantom became that name. What made the situation even more unsettling was the randomness of it all. There were no ransom notes, no demands, no clear motive. The victims seemed chosen only by chance. Couples who had once gone for late-night drives now stayed home. Parents refused to let their children walk alone. Texarkana transformed from a quiet border town into a community under siege. Residents boarded up their windows, nailed shut their doors, and bought dogs for protection. Gun shops could not keep up with the rush. People who had never owned a firearm before now carried one everywhere. Police patrols doubled, then tripled. Still, the Phantom remained unseen. For investigators, the growing myth became its own obstacle. Witnesses began reporting shadows, footsteps, even faces they thought they saw, but none of it ever led anywhere. The Phantom had become both real and unreal, both a person and a story. And perhaps that is what made the case so unforgettable. The Phantom was not just a killer. He was the reflection of every fear the town had buried: fear of the unknown, fear of the dark, fear that safety itself was only an illusion. Years later, people would still recall those spring nights of 1946. Not the faces of the victims, not the sound of the gunshots, but the silence that followed, the silence of a town waiting for a phantom that might never come again, or might never have left. The first scream of fear echoed through Texarkana in late February 1946. At first, it was just a strange story whispered around town: 2 young people attacked on a quiet road, the man beaten nearly to death, the woman chased through the dark by a figure wearing a sack mask. The survivors lived, but their descriptions sent chills down every spine in town. He was tall, silent, and faceless, eyes hidden behind crude holes in white fabric. No one wanted to believe it would happen again, but then it did. On the night of March 24th, another couple, Richard Griffin and Polly and Moore, parked their car just outside town. By morning, they were found lifeless inside the vehicle. The news spread faster than the police could contain it. This time, there was no survivor, no one to explain what had happened. Only the pattern was becoming clear: couples, darkness, and the moonlight roads around Texarkana. Just 3 weeks later, it struck again. Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, both young and full of promise, disappeared after a Saturday night dance. Martin's body was found first, lying near a country road. Betty Jo's was discovered 2 miles away, her saxophone missing. That single missing instrument became one of the most haunting symbols of the entire case, a reminder that something ordinary could vanish along with a life. The town was now living in panic. The police patrolled every rural road. Families refused to sit near windows at night. Couples no longer dared to meet in private. Reporters camped outside the police station, waiting for any word of a suspect. But the Phantom seemed to know every move before it happened. Then came the final act, the night of May 3rd, 1946. Unlike the earlier attacks, this one did not happen in a parked car, but inside a home. Virgil and Katie Starks were a respected farming couple living just outside Texarkana. As Virgil sat in his chair reading the newspaper, 2 shots came through the window, striking him instantly. Katie, terrified but determined, ran to call for help, but another bullet grazed her face. Bleeding and half blind, she somehow escaped the house, sprinted barefoot across the road, and collapsed on a neighbor's porch. She survived. That final attack confirmed one thing: the Phantom was not confined to the back roads anymore. He could strike anywhere. After May, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No arrests, no closure, no explanation. The 10 weeks of terror had ended, but the shadow remained. By the end of that spring, Texarkana was no longer just a dot on the map. It was a warning, a story told in hushed voices for generations. A reminder that sometimes the scariest thing about a killer is not what he does. It is that he simply disappears. When people talk about the Phantom of Texarkana, they often speak of the terror of the mask, the mystery, the long nights of silence. But behind every headline, there were people ordinary, hopeful, full of life whose names became forever tied to a legend they never asked to be part of. The story begins with Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean, Larry the first to encounter the Phantom. It was late February, just another quiet evening out. They parked their car on a secluded road, the kind of spot where young couples went to talk, to dream, to feel free. But the night did not stay quiet for long. A beam of light pierced the dark of flashlight, and a voice ordered them out of the car. The man wore a sack over his head, 2 holes cut crudely for eyes. He struck Jimmy with such force that bones cracked, and chased Mary Jean into the darkness. Somehow both lived. When she finally reached help, barefoot and trembling, the town's peace had already been broken. Then came Richard Griffin and Polly and more, just a month later. They had spent the evening together, talking and laughing, unaware that their final drive would become part of American folklore. When their car was found, the windows fogged and the doors locked, the quiet road became a crime scene. It was clear the Phantom had returned colder, bolder, and more deliberate. In April, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker met a similar fate. Paul was just 17, gentle and reliable. Betty Jo was a talented musician. Her saxophone, shiny in gold, was her pride. She played at the VFW club that night, her music carrying through the air, never knowing it would be her last performance. When her body was found 2 miles from Paul's, the missing saxophone became a haunting symbol, a melody cut short, a voice silenced before it could finish the song. And finally, Virgil and Katie Starks, a hard-working couple whose life revolved around their small farm. Virgil read the newspaper by lamplight, while Katie sewed nearby a picture of peace. The shots came suddenly through the window. Katie's escape, bloodied and barefoot, became a story of pure courage. Even in horror, she refused to surrender. Each of them was more than a name in an old file. They were sons, daughters, lovers, and neighbors, pieces of a community that had to learn to live with the unthinkable. Their stories remind us that true crime is not just about the mystery of who did it, but about who was lost because of it. The Phantom may have vanished, but the echo of those 10 weeks in 1946 still lingers, not as a ghost story, but as a human one. In every mystery, there is a pattern, a rhythm behind the chaos. For the people of Texarkana, that rhythm was terrifyingly familiar: 2 people, a car, and the cover of night. The Phantom did not strike at random. His victims shared a setting: quiet country roads, moonlit clearings, places where young couples thought they were safe from the world's noise. They went there to talk, to laugh, to dream about futures that would never come. And somehow, that fragile privacy became the killer's hunting ground. To investigators, the consistency of his choices revealed something chilling. The Phantom seemed to study his victims. He knew where the lovers' lanes were when people would gather there, and how long it would take police to respond once the silence broke. It was not reckless violence. It was controlled, precise, almost ritualistic. At first, the police wondered whether it was someone familiar with the area, perhaps a hunter, a local, or even an officer who understood patrol patterns. Others thought he could be a traveler, using back roads to cross the state line unseen. Whatever the truth, his method stayed constant. He appeared without warning, sometimes with a flashlight, blinding his victims before they could react. He attacked swiftly, then disappeared without leaving clear evidence. He did not steal valuables or take trophies, except once: Betty Jo Booker's missing saxophone. That small detail left detectives wondering, was the theft symbolic, or simply a way to confuse investigators? The pattern also revealed something psychological. The Phantom's attacks on couples reflected a deeper sense of dominance, targeting intimacy itself. He did not just take lives. He shattered a sense of safety shared by an entire generation. In 1946, young people were still celebrating peace after a long world war. The country wanted to believe danger was far away. The Phantom reminded them it was not. Texarkana's police chief once said, "He could be anyone. A man sitting beside you in church or the stranger walking past you downtown." That uncertainty made the case larger than any crime scene. The Phantom was not just hunting people, he was hunting peace of mind. After each attack, more couples vanished from the roads. The movie theaters closed earlier. Families gathered indoors by sunset. The Phantom did not need to show himself anymore. Fear had already taken his place. And that is what made his pattern so haunting. It was not just about who he attacked, but what he destroyed: trust, safety, and the illusion that love could make you untouchable. The Phantom of Texarkana did not just haunt the shadows. He turned every quiet night into a question. Is someone out there watching us too? He was called the Phantom for a reason. Not because he was invisible, but because he could appear and vanish so quickly that people began to doubt he was real at all. The survivors, few as they were, gave only fragments of a description. A tall man 6 feet or more with a strong build and heavy steps. His voice was calm, deliberate, never rushed. But it was his mask that haunted the most, a crude white sack pulled over his head, with 2 eye holes cut unevenly. No features, no identity, just the image of emptiness staring back. That mask became his signature, simple, handmade, and deeply symbolic. It stripped away humanity, turning him into something that felt more like a force than a man. It reminded people of wartime gas masks, of soldiers who had seen too much. In a town full of veterans and scars from World War II, that was a terrifying echo. Witnesses described how the Phantom moved not frantic, not sloppy, but measured. He seemed to know exactly how long he had before anyone could arrive. When he spoke, his words were short and controlled. There was no anger, no shouting, only the cold authority of someone who had already decided what would happen. Police reports suggested he used a flashlight to blind his victims before attacking, a tactic both tactical and psychological. It meant that even if they survived, the last thing they saw was a circle of white light and the outline of that featureless mask. Investigators searched for patterns in his behavior: military precision, methodical planning, maybe even knowledge of firearms and rural terrain. Many began to believe he had served in the war. That theory gained traction when the FBI got involved. The idea that the Phantom might have been a soldier who returned home changed, shaped by something dark that never left the battlefield. But others thought differently. To them, the Phantom was not driven by training, but by control. The way he stalked his victims suggested someone who enjoyed being unseen, someone who found power in anonymity. The mask was not just a disguise. It was liberation. Years later, that image, the sack mask, the flashlight, the silence would inspire books, films, and nightmares. It became a cultural myth, the faceless stranger who turns ordinary places into traps. Yet, despite the theories and sketches, no one ever saw the Phantom's true face. Not the survivors, not the police, not the journalists who followed every lead. He could have walked past any of them in daylight, and they would never have known. That was his greatest weapon, not the gun, not the mask, but invisibility. Because how do you fight something you can't identify? How do you chase a ghost? Each attack in Texarkana followed the same grim pattern, but each time it grew bolder. The Phantom seemed to be testing not only his victims, but the entire town. And as the weeks went by, his message became clear. No one was beyond his reach. The first assault on February 22nd, 1946, was brutal but not fatal. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were returning home when a beam of light cut through the darkness. The man behind the flashlight ordered them out of their car. "Do as I say, and you won't be hurt," he told them, a promise that proved false within seconds. Jimmy was struck again and again, his skull fractured, while Mary Jean fled barefoot into the cold night. She ran nearly a mile before finding help. The town awoke the next morning to whispers of a masked attacker on the loose. At first, people hoped it was an isolated event, a robbery gone wrong. But on March 24th, hope vanished. Richard Griffin and Polly and more were found dead in their car on a lonely dirt road. Their hands were clasped, as if they had tried to hold on to each other in their final moments. The car doors were locked from the inside, suggesting they had never seen the danger coming. By then, newspapers had already chosen a name for the faceless threat, the Phantom Killer. The third attack, on April 14th, struck the deepest chord. Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, both bright, talented teenagers, vanished after a Saturday night dance. Their bodies were discovered hours apart. Paul had been shot 4 times. Betty Jo twice. Her saxophone, her prized instrument, was missing. Detectives searched for weeks, convinced that the instrument might hold a clue. But it was found months later in the woods, rusted and silent. The final known attack came on May 3rd, and it broke the pattern. This time, the victims were not teenagers in a car. They were adults in their own home. Virgil and Katie Starks, a quiet farming couple, were preparing for bed. Virgil sat in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper. Katie sewed beside him. Then, 2 bullets tore through the window, striking Virgil instantly. Katie's survival was nothing short of miraculous. Wounded and terrified, she crawled through broken glass, ran barefoot across the field, and collapsed at a neighbor's door, still calling her husband's name. By morning, Texarkana was a fortress. Roadblocks were set up at every exit. Police from both Texas and Arkansas joined forces. The National Guard patrolled the outskirts, but the Phantom, whoever he was, had already vanished. 5 dead, 3 survivors, 10 weeks of terror, and not a single arrest. Texarkana's spring of 1946 ended not with justice, but with silence, the kind that makes you wonder whether the darkness ever really left. Every town that endures a nightmare has a few who live to tell the story, not heroes, but survivors who carry the weight of what they saw. In Texarkana, there were only 3. Their words would become the only real glimpse the world ever had of the Phantom. The first voice came from Mary Jean Larry, just 19 years old. She and her boyfriend, Jimmy Hollis, had been out for a quiet drive when a man with a flashlight appeared in front of their car. The light was blinding. The voice was cold. "Get out," he said, calm, not angry. Jimmy tried to reason with him, but the figure struck him again and again with a pistol, each blow echoing across the empty road. Then he turned toward Mary Jean. She ran barefoot, bleeding, and terrified into the night. For half a mile, she could hear his footsteps behind her, the crunch of gravel following her every move. When she finally reached a nearby house and screamed for help, the door opened and the chase ended. When asked later what she saw, she said only this: "He wore a white sack over his head. I could not see his face, just 2 dark holes for eyes." That image became the symbol of the entire case. The next survivor, Katie Starks, had faced something even more horrifying: the Phantom inside her own home. The night of May 3rd, 1946, began like any other. Her husband, Virgil, was reading his newspaper when two shots shattered the window. Katie saw him fall before she even realized she would have been hit too. Despite her injuries, she crawled through broken glass and staggered into the fields, calling for help. When rescuers arrived, they found blood on the walls, a broken telephone line, and footprints outside the window, proof that the Phantom had watched them first. Katie's memory of that night remained vivid for decades. She never saw his face, but she remembered the feeling that he was patient, silent, and absolutely certain of what he was doing. The third set of accounts came from witnesses who did not survive long enough to testify: neighbors who heard screams, farmers who found tire tracks, drivers who saw a figure slipping through the woods. Their stories, though incomplete, added layers to the legend. All of these fragments, a flashlight beam, a sack mask, a calm voice, formed a picture that was haunting precisely because it was incomplete. In the end, the survivors described not a monster, but something worse. A man who looked ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. A man who could have walked past them the next morning, nodding politely, as if nothing had happened. That is the kind of terror that lingers not just in the mind, but in the imagination. Because when you never see the face of the one who hurt you, every stranger becomes a possibility. By the summer of 1946, the people of Texarkana were desperate for answers. The Phantom had disappeared as suddenly as he had come, and fear hung over the town like a fog that refused to lift. Then a name surfaced: a petty criminal with a familiar face in the police station. Yowl Lee Swinney. Swinney was not a stranger to trouble. He had a record: car theft, counterfeiting, and small-time scams. The police first noticed him because of a stolen vehicle, but when they questioned his wife, Peggy, the story took a dark turn. What she told them would shake Texarkana to its core. According to Peggy, her husband was the Phantom. She described the roads, the cars, even where he had hidden certain items belonging to the victims. She spoke of nights when he disappeared without explanation, returning dirty, silent, and furious if she asked where he had been. She even mentioned a spot in the woods where he had thrown away something shiny, perhaps Betty Jo Booker's missing saxophone. Detectives followed her directions, and to their shock, some of what she said matched the evidence. For the first time, the town dared to hope the nightmare was over. But then everything unraveled. Because of spousal privilege laws at the time, Peggy could not be forced to testify against her husband in court. And when the pressure mounted, she changed her story, claiming she had made it up, that she had been confused, that none of it was real. Without her testimony, the case against Yowl Swinney collapsed. The authorities tried to hold him on other charges: vehicle theft, forgery, and he was eventually sentenced to prison, but not for murder. The Phantom killings remained untouched. Over the years, police officers, FBI agents, and journalists revisited the Swinney theory again and again. His background fit certain details. He was familiar with the area, had a violent temper, and had been active during the exact months of the attacks. When he was imprisoned, the killings stopped a coincidence too large for some to ignore. But there were problems too. No physical evidence tied him to the murders. No eyewitness could place him near the scenes. Even the bullets, the one clue investigators hoped would reveal the truth, offered no match that could confirm his guilt. Swinney lived the rest of his life under a shadow. Some called him the Phantom. Others called him a scapegoat. He never confessed, not once, even on his deathbed. And so the case drifted back into mystery. Was Yowl Swinney the man behind the mask, or just the unlucky figure who happened to fit the story too well? In the end, Texarkana was left with what it feared most: not a killer in custody, but a question that would never go away. Decades have passed since the spring of 1946, yet Texarkana still remembers. The town has changed, the streets are busier. The fields where the couples once parked are now quiet subdivisions, but the memory of the phantom lingers like a shadow that refuses to fade. For nearly 80 years, the case has remained unsolved. No one was ever tried, no official confession was ever made, and the file's hundreds of pages of interviews, photographs, and reports sit gathering dust in archives. But that does not mean people have stopped searching. In the 1970s, renewed interest in the case surfaced after the release of the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which dramatized the Phantom's crimes. The movie rekindled both fascination and fear. For younger generations, it was a haunting story from their grandparents' time. For survivors and locals, it reopened old wounds. By the late 20th century, cold case detectives and true crime researchers began looking at the Phantom again, this time with better tools, ballistics analysis, criminal profiling, and later, the promise of DNA testing. However, much of the original evidence had been lost, degraded, or misplaced over the decades. The rural crime scenes of 1946 had not been preserved with modern forensics in mind. There were no DNA samples, no stored fibers, no fingerprints that could survive time. In the early 2000s, the FBI officially declassified its files on the Texarkana Moonlight murders. The documents revealed the chaos of the investigation, the dozens of suspects, the conflicting witness statements, and the desperate leads that went nowhere. For modern investigators, the files were a window into a different era, one where fear and confusion often worked faster than the facts. Occasionally, new theories emerge online from amateur sleuths and podcasters to professional profilers. Some suggest that the Phantom was indeed Yoel Lee Swinney, citing the timing of his arrest. Others believe it was a local man who died or moved away before he could be caught. A few even argue that the Phantom might have been a soldier passing through, his identity forever lost to history. But despite the speculation, one fact remains unshaken: there is no conclusive evidence. The Texarkana Police Department has long since closed its official investigation, though it remains open in spirit, revisited every few years when new eyes take another look. Still, the trail grows colder with each passing generation. And yet, there is something strangely enduring about the case. It is not just about the killer anymore. It is about a community that endured, a mystery that defied resolution, and the way fear can shape memory long after the danger is gone. The Phantom may be gone, or maybe, in a way, he never left, still haunting the edges of old newspaper clippings, still walking through the imagination of a town that will never forget those 10 weeks of silence and moonlight. Time has a way of turning horror into history, but sometimes history refuses to rest. In recent years, from 2020 onward, the Texarkana Phantom case has found new life, not through new crimes, but through renewed curiosity. When the FBI declassified its archives under the Freedom of Information Act, journalists and amateur sleuths alike began to dig through hundreds of pages of forgotten details, witness statements, hand-drawn maps, and memos typed on aging paper. What they found did not solve the case, but it reignited fascination. The files revealed how chaotic the investigation had been, how two police departments, one from Texas and one from Arkansas, often clashed over jurisdiction. It showed just how many suspects had once filled the case board, from soldiers and mechanics to drifters who had passed through town. Each lead seemed promising at first, only to fade under closer inspection. Among the rediscovered materials was a chilling photograph of the crude mask said to resemble what the survivors had described: a white cloth sack with eye holes unevenly cut. Even on paper, it was unsettling. That image alone brought a wave of new public attention, with true crime podcasts and YouTube documentaries analyzing every thread of the story. Several modern researchers have revisited Yowl Lee Swinney as a suspect, using behavioral profiling techniques that did not exist in the 1940s. Some analysts argue that his personality, controlling, secretive, and quick to anger, fits the Phantom's psychological pattern. But again, there is no DNA, no fingerprints, no definitive link. Just speculation and a ghost of a motive. Others have proposed more unconventional theories, that the Phantom might have been a war veteran struggling with trauma, or even a pair of attackers rather than one. Forensic historians note that the attacks showed both precision and inconsistency, suggesting either emotional instability or multiple perpetrators. Meanwhile, the story of Texarkana has evolved beyond its fear. Every October, the town holds an outdoor screening of the town that dreaded sundown, right where one of the murders took place. It is both a tribute and a strange ritual, where fear has become folklore. Locals bring picnic blankets, teenagers whisper about ghosts, and the same moon that once lit the crime scenes now shines peacefully overhead. In many ways, the modern fascination says more about us than about the Phantom. It shows our endless desire to explain what cannot be explained, to find closure in mysteries that defy logic. The Phantom story has moved from police reports to podcasts, from newspaper ink to digital screens, yet it remains the same haunting question. How can someone vanish so completely, not just from sight, but from history itself? The FBI files may be open, but the answers remain locked. And so in 2025, nearly 80 years later, the Phantom of Texarkana still walks not down the dusty backroads, but through our collective imagination, where every shadow still has a story. Every town has a story it can't forget. For Texarkana, that story wears a mask. The Phantom Killer did not just haunt the people he attacked, he haunted the imagination of everyone who heard his name. Over time, his shadow stretched far beyond the Arkansas-Texas border, becoming part of America's darker folklore. In 1976, the legend reached the screen with the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. It was part documentary, part dramatization, a chilling retelling of the spring when fear ruled the night. The movie shocked audiences not just for its realism, but for how close it felt to the truth. For the people of Texarkana, it was not fiction, it was memory. Years later, the town itself embraced the story, screening the film each year in the same park where one of the real attacks happened. What once symbolized terror slowly transformed into tradition, a yearly reminder that the past still breathes quietly beneath the surface. Books, podcasts, documentaries, and even songs have revisited the case. Each generation discovers the Phantom anew, adding theories and retellings, mixing fact and fear until the line between them blurs. Some treat him as a mystery to be solved. Others see him as a ghost of small-town America, a symbol of the fragile peace between light and shadow. The Phantom of Texarkana became a template for countless stories that followed. The image of a masked figure in the dark, faceless, silent, unstoppable has echoed through decades of cinema, from horror thrillers to true crime dramas. He became not just a criminal, but a cultural archetype, the unknown intruder, the man you never see coming. Yet beneath all the storytelling lies something more human, a reflection of how fear changes a community. For those who lived through 1946, the Phantom was not a myth, but a man who shattered their sense of safety. Neighbors stopped trusting strangers. Couples no longer parked under the stars. The night itself became suspect. And yet, the people of Texarkana endured. They rebuilt their lives, raised families, and passed down the story not as a warning, but as a lesson that even in the darkest times, a community can survive its fear. Today, when the town gathers under the open sky to watch the town that dreaded sundown, it feels less like a horror story and more like remembrance. Children sit beside grandparents who still recall the curfews and sirens. The same moonlight that once witnessed tragedy now shines over laughter and conversation. In that transformation from panic to peace, from crime to cautionary tale, lies the true legacy of the Phantom. He may have vanished long ago, but what he left behind is timeless, a reminder that evil, like memory, can never truly disappear, only change its form. And so, our story returns to where it began, a small border town, a quiet night, and a question that still hangs in the air nearly 80 years later. Who was the Phantom of Texarkana? We may never know his name, his face, or his reasons. But perhaps that is what gives this story its enduring power. Because behind every unsolved mystery lies something universal, our fear of the unknown and our fascination with it. The Phantom was not just a man. He was a mirror. He reflected what happens when safety turns into suspicion, when darkness falls not only on the streets, but also inside the human heart. In 1946, he silenced 5 lives. But he also changed the rhythm of an entire town that learned to lock its doors, to travel in pairs, to question every shadow. Yet, even in that fear, there was resilience. The people of Texarkana did not let the terror define them. They rebuilt. They remembered. And in remembering, they took back their story. Every spring, when the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown plays beneath the same stars that once lit those lonely roads, it is no longer about the killer. It is about the survivors, the families, the community that refused to be erased. That is the strange poetry of true crime. We chase the darkness, but what we find, more often than not, is light. Maybe that is why stories like this stay with us. Because deep down, we all want to believe that truth can still rise even from the coldest of cases. So tonight, as we close the file on the Texarkana Phantom, let us remember what this story really is, not just a tale of fear, but a testament to endurance. Time moves on. The evidence fades. But memory never dies. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into one of America's most haunting mysteries. If you'd like to explore more forgotten stories, more unanswered questions, or more echoes from the past, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share what you believe really happened in Texarkana that spring. Until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and remember, some mysteries are meant not to frighten us, but to remind us how fragile peace truly is. Good night, everyone.